The stars in the outer rim looked different than they did in the core worlds. They were sharper somehow and colder, and more honest about the dangers that lurked between them. Jake Morrison had spent the last 7 years learning every route and shortcut through this forgotten corner of the galaxy. His ship was called the Midnight Runner, and it was not the fastest vessel or the strongest, but it had something more valuable than raw power. It had a pilot who knew how to think 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Jake sat in the captain's chair and stared at the holographic message that floated in front of him. The offer had come through encrypted channels from Frontier Station 7. They needed medical supplies, and they needed them desperately. A plague had broken out on the station, and the Galactic Trade Consortium had refused to lift their blockade. Politics mattered more than lives to the consortium, and that was something Jake had learned to despise about the galaxy's so-called civilized species. The pay for this job was substantial, but Jake had never chosen his work based solely on credits. He took jobs that meant something, and this one meant saving about 3,000 colonists who had done nothing wrong except settle on a world that 2 alien governments wanted to fight over. Casey Brooks walked onto the bridge with 2 cups of recycled coffee substitute. She was the best pilot Jake had ever known, and he had seen her thread their ship through debris fields that would have turned other pilots into paste against the nearest asteroid. She handed him 1 cup and kept the other for herself. The liquid tasted like burnt metal, but it was hot and it was caffeinated, and that was enough for the moment. Casey looked at the message display and raised 1 eyebrow. She had a way of communicating entire conversations with just her face, and right now her expression said she knew this. Job was going to be trouble. Jake took a long drink from his cup and ignored the burning sensation on his tongue. He had been running cargo through contested space for long enough to recognize a trap when he saw one. The route to Frontier Station 7 led straight through the Nereid Belt, and there were only so many ways to navigate an asteroid field safely. Anyone with half a brain and access to shipping schedules could figure out where to wait for him. The Kralix enforcement fleet had been trying to catch him for 8 months now, and they were not the kind to give up easily. They were methodical and patient, and they had resources that made Jake's operation look like a child playing with toys. Frank Cooper emerged from the engineering bay, wiping grease from his hands. He was older than both Jake and Casey by at least 20 years, and he had forgotten more about ship systems than most engineers ever learned. His gray hair was tied back in a short ponytail, and his weathered face carried the expression of a man who had seen every possible way a ship could break down and had fixed most of them at least twice. Frank glanced at the message and then at Jake and then back at the message. He did not say anything for a long moment because Frank never spoke unless he had something worth saying. The silence stretched out between the 3 of them. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their slow dance across the black canvas of space. A small mining vessel drifted past their position, and its running lights blinked in a pattern that indicated it was operating under legitimate salvage rights. Jake watched it go and wondered what it would be like to have a simple job like that, where the biggest worry was finding enough ore to make the fuel costs worthwhile. But he had never been good at simple, and the galaxy seemed determined to reward him for his complexity. Casey broke the silence first. She always did. She pointed out that the colonists on Frontier Station 7 included about 800 children, and the plague was hitting them hardest. She mentioned that the medical supplies sitting in a warehouse on Covenant Prime would save most of those lives if someone could just get them past the blockade. She did not make it sound like she was trying to guilt Jake into anything. She just stated facts and let those facts speak for themselves. That was Casey's way, and it was one of the reasons Jake trusted her judgment even when it contradicted his own instincts. Frank finally spoke up. He said the shield generators were running at 112% efficiency after his latest modifications. He had rerouted power from 3 non-essential systems and calibrated the harmonic frequencies to disperse energy weapon impacts more effectively. The ship could take a beating now, and Frank seemed almost proud of that fact in his quiet, understated way. He did not say they should take the job, but he made sure Jake knew the Midnight Runner was ready for whatever came next. Jake set down his cup and pulled up a star chart. The Nereid Belt glowed red on the display, marking it as a navigation hazard. Standard Doctrine said to avoid asteroid fields whenever possible, but Standard Doctrine also said smugglers should not exist, and yet here Jake was proving that particular doctrine wrong on a daily basis. He traced 3 possible routes through the belt with his finger. All of them had choke points, and all of them could be monitored by anyone with decent sensor equipment. The Kralix would know this, too, and they would be waiting at whichever point offered them the best tactical advantage. Vorthak was the name of the Kralix commander who had been hunting Jake. Intelligence reports said he was brilliant and thorough and completely obsessed with bringing human smugglers to justice. The Kralix valued order above all else, and humans represented chaos in their carefully structured view of the universe. Vorthak had studied every escape Jake had ever made, and he had probably compiled psychological profiles and tactical assessments. The Kralix did not do anything halfway, and that made them dangerous in a way that went beyond simple firepower. Jake closed the star chart and looked at Casey and Frank. They were both watching him and waiting for a decision. He could turn down the job and find something safer, and no one would blame him for choosing survival over heroism. But those kids on Frontier Station 7 did not have time for him to find another job and another route and another solution. They needed the medicine now, and Jake was the only one crazy enough to try running the blockade. He had built his reputation on being the smuggler who took impossible jobs and somehow came back alive. That reputation was about to be tested in a way it had never been tested before. Casey asked the question that hung in the air between them. She wanted to know if Jake thought they could make it through. Jake looked at the star chart one more time and then looked back at his crew. He told them honestly that he thought the Kralix would be waiting, and they would probably have overwhelming force on their side. He said the odds were not good, and anyone who wanted to walk away from this job could do so without any hard feelings. Neither Casey nor Frank moved toward the exit. They just kept looking at him and waiting for him to finish. Jake stood up from the captain's chair and walked to the viewport. The Midnight Runner was not much to look at from the outside. It was a modified cargo hauler with extra engines bolted on, and armor plating welded over the critical systems, but it was home, and it had carried them through situations that should have killed them a dozen times over. The ship had personality and quirks and a tendency to make strange noises when it jumped to faster than light speeds. Jake put his hand against the cold metal of the viewport and felt the subtle vibration of the engines humming through the hull. He turned back to face Casey and Frank. He told them to plot a course for the Nereid Belt and to make sure every system was running at peak efficiency. They were going to take the job, and they were going to deliver those medical supplies even if the entire Kralix enforcement fleet was waiting for them. Casey grinned and headed back to the pilot station. Frank nodded once and returned to engineering to run final checks on the systems. Jake sat back down in his chair and pulled up the contract acceptance form. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner and transmitted their confirmation to Frontier Station 7. The die was cast, and there was no turning back now. Somewhere out in the Nereid Belt, a trap was waiting to spring shut. Vorthak and his ships were probably already moving into position and calculating firing solutions. The Kralix believed they had finally cornered the human smuggler who had embarrassed them for months. They believed this time would be different. Jake allowed himself a small smile. They were right that this time would be different. They just had no idea how different it was going to be. The Midnight Runner dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Nereid Belt exactly on schedule. The asteroid stretched out before them like a frozen ocean of rock and ice and ancient debris from some cosmic collision that happened millions of years ago. Casey had her hands on the controls and her eyes scanned the navigation display with the kind of focus that came from years of experience. Frank was in engineering, monitoring every system and making small adjustments to keep everything running smooth. Jake stood behind Casey's chair and watched the sensor readout with growing unease. The first warning came 3 seconds after they entered normal space. The proximity alarm started screaming, and red indicators lit up across every panel on the bridge. Casey's hands flew across the controls as she pulled up the tactical display. What she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. 6 contacts had appeared on the sensors, and they were big. Each one was broadcasting Kralix military identification codes, and their energy signatures showed active weapon systems and shields. The ships had been hiding in the asteroid field using some kind of stealth technology, and now they were decloaking in a pattern that surrounded the Midnight Runner completely. Jake felt his stomach drop, but his face remained calm. He had known the Kralix would be waiting, but he had not expected them to commit 6 warships to catching one smuggler. That was a level of resources that spoke to how badly Vorthak wanted him captured. The Kralix ships were moving into position with practiced precision, and within seconds they had formed a perfect sphere around the human vessel. There was no gap in their formation and no angle that was not covered by at least two overlapping fields of fire. It was a textbook military encirclement, and it was beautiful in the way that deadly things could sometimes be beautiful. The communication system crackled to life, and a voice came through the speakers. It was calm and measured and carried the slight clicking undertone that marked it as Kralix. Vorthak identified himself as commander of the enforcement fleet, and he listed Jake's alleged crimes in a tone that suggested he was reading from a prepared document. Smuggling contraband across restricted borders, evading lawful detention, resisting arrest, destruction of consortium property during an escape attempt. The list went on for almost a full minute, and Jake had to admit that most of it was technically accurate, even if the legal framework was questionable. Vorthak's voice changed slightly when he finished the list. There was satisfaction there and maybe even a hint of relief. He informed Jake that escape was impossible and resistance would only result in the destruction of his ship and the death of his crew. The asteroid field prevented any jump to faster than light speeds, because the gravitational interference would tear the ship apart. The Kralix warships had enough firepower to reduce the Midnight Runner to molecular dust in under 30 seconds. Surrender was the only logical option, and Vorthak seemed genuinely convinced that Jake would see reason and give up. Casey ran the numbers, and her fingers moved across the navigation computer with desperate speed. She was looking for any possible exit route, but the math was not in their favor. The Kralix ships had positioned themselves perfectly to cut off every conventional escape vector. She pulled up the asteroid density maps and looked for places where the Midnight Runner might hide, but the rocks were too spread out to provide meaningful cover. Her tactical assessment appeared on Jake's personal display, and the conclusion was clear. They were trapped and outgunned, and the only rational choice was to surrender and hope for mercy. Frank's voice came through the internal communication system from engineering. He reported that the shields were at full strength and the engines were running hot but ready. The weapon systems were online but laughably inadequate against 6 military warships. He could maybe take out one ship if they got lucky, and if the Kralix captain was asleep at his post. Against 6 ships working in coordination, they would be obliterated before they got off more than a few shots. Frank did not say they should surrender, but his tone suggested he was thinking it very loudly. Jake stood perfectly still and let his eyes track across the tactical display. The Kralix formation was precise and professional, and followed every rule in the standard enforcement manual. Vorthak had studied human tactics, but he had used that study to create a Kralix solution to a human problem. The warships were positioned with mathematical accuracy, and their overlapping fields of fire created zones of death that no ship could survive passing through. It was brilliant strategy, and it should have worked against any reasonable opponent. But Jake had not stayed alive this long by being reasonable. His eyes focused on the asteroids themselves. The Nereid Belt was named after an old Earth myth about sea nymphs, and it had earned that name because of the unusual composition of many of the larger rocks. They were not just stone and metal like most asteroids. Many of them contained frozen volatiles including water ice and ammonia, and significant deposits of methane. The belt had been formed when a comet collided with a small moon, and the resulting debris cloud had mixed together materials that normally would not be found in the same place. Most ships avoided the belt not just because of the navigation hazard, but because impacts with certain asteroids could trigger unexpected chemical reactions. Jake's mind started working through a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, and he was not entirely sure which. He turned to Casey and asked her a question about their maximum acceleration with shields at full power. She gave him a number that was higher than he had expected thanks to Frank's modifications. He asked Frank through the communication system if he could reroute all power from the weapons and life support to the shields and engines for exactly 90 seconds. There was a long pause before Frank answered. He said yes, but pointed out that they would be defenseless and the crew would be breathing vacuum in about 2 minutes, without life support. Casey turned in her chair to look at Jake with an expression that mixed confusion with concern. She wanted to know what he was thinking, but Jake just told her to trust him. He needed her to fly like she had never flown before, and he needed her to follow his directions exactly without questioning them, even if those directions seemed insane. Casey had known Jake long enough to recognize the look in his eyes. It was the same look he got right before he did something that should not work, but somehow did anyway. She nodded once and turned back to her controls. Jake opened a communication channel to Vorthak, and his voice was calm and almost friendly. He said he needed a few minutes to discuss surrender terms with his crew. Vorthak's response showed clear satisfaction. The Kralix commander agreed to give Jake 5 minutes to come to the correct decision. He reminded Jake that any attempt to escape would be met with immediate destruction, but his tone suggested he did not really believe Jake would be foolish enough to try. The channel stayed open and Jake could hear the background noise of the Kralix bridge. They were confident and relaxed and already celebrating their victory. Jake used those 5 minutes to explain his plan to Casey and Frank. Casey's eyes went wide when she understood what he wanted her to do. Frank muttered something in engineering that the communication system could not quite pick up, but probably involved questioning Jake's sanity. Neither of them refused. They had been through too much together to doubt each other now. Casey began plotting a flight path that looked like it had been designed by someone with a death wish. Frank started the process of rerouting power systems, and his hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a master engineer. The 5 minutes ticked down with agonizing slowness. Vorthak's voice came through the speakers asking if Jake had reached a decision. The Kralix commander's tone was patient, but underneath that patience was steel. He would wait for an answer, but his patience had limits. The 6 warships held their positions, and their weapon systems remained hot and ready. Every sensor on every ship was focused on the Midnight Runner, waiting for any sign of hostile action. Jake looked at Casey and Frank through their various displays and camera feeds. These 2 people had followed him across the galaxy and trusted him with their lives more times than he could count. They deserved a captain who would keep them safe, and instead they had him. But they also had a ship full of medical supplies that sick children needed, and they had the skills and courage to do what needed to be done. Jake took a deep breath and opened the channel to Vorthak one last time. He thanked the Kralix commander for his patience, and then he said something that made Vorthak pause. Jake said he had one question before he surrendered. He asked if Vorthak had ever studied human history, and specifically human military history. Vorthak responded with confusion in his voice. He did not understand what history had to do with the current situation. Jake smiled, even though the Kralix could not see his face. He said humans had a saying about cornered animals being the most dangerous, and then he cut the communication channel. Jake's voice rang out across the bridge. He shouted the single word that would either save them or kill them. Casey's hands moved, and the Midnight Runner surged forward with acceleration that pressed everyone back into their seats. Frank triggered the power reroute, and the shields flared bright blue as every available watt of energy poured into them. The ship was not heading away from. The Midnight Runner screamed through the asteroid field at speeds that would have terrified any sane pilot. Casey's hands moved across the controls with movements so fast they blurred, and her eyes tracked 3 different displays at once. The ship twisted and rolled and dove through gaps between asteroids that looked too narrow for anything larger than a probe to pass through. Behind them, the 6 Kralix warships broke formation and gave chase. Their weapon systems opened fire, and the space around the human ship lit up with energy blasts that would have vaporized the Midnight Runner if any of them had connected. But Casey was not flying in straight lines. She was flying in patterns that seemed random, but were actually calculated chaos. Every roll and twist took advantage of the asteroids for cover, and every acceleration put another chunk of rock between them and the pursuing warships. The Kralix ships were faster and more powerful, but they were also bigger and less maneuverable. What worked in open space became a liability in the tight confines of an asteroid field. Their captains had to slow down or risk. Collision, and that hesitation gave the Midnight Runner precious seconds of distance. Jake stood behind Casey's chair with one hand braced against the bulkhead to keep from being thrown across the bridge. The gravity compensators were struggling to keep up with the violent maneuvers, and his stomach lurched with every sudden direction change. He watched the tactical display and tracked their position relative to the methane-rich asteroids he had identified earlier. They were getting close, but not close enough yet. The Kralix were beginning to adjust their tactics and spread out to cut off possible escape routes. Vorthak's voice came through the communication system, demanding surrender and promising that continued resistance would only make their eventual punishment more severe. Frank's voice cut through the chaos from engineering. He reported that the shields were holding, but barely. Each near miss from the Kralix weapons sent power fluctuations through the system, and he was having to manually reroute energy to compensate. The engines were running at 115% of their rated capacity, and that was not sustainable for more than another few minutes. The hull temperature was rising, and several minor systems had already shut down to prevent overload. He gave them maybe 3 minutes before something critical failed, and then they would be dead in space and completely at the mercy of the Kralix. Casey shouted a warning and threw the ship into a barrel roll that brought them within meters of a massive asteroid. The Kralix weapons fire that had been tracking them struck the asteroid instead, and the impact sent fragments spinning in all directions. One of the pursuing warships could not change course fast enough, and several large chunks of rock slammed into its forward shields. The shields held, but the ship had to break off pursuit temporarily, while its systems recovered from the impact. That left 5 ships still chasing them, but 5 was better than 6. Jake's eyes never left the tactical display. He was counting distances and calculating trajectories in his head. The largest cluster of methane asteroids was coming up fast, and he needed the Kralix ships to be in exactly the right position when they reached it. He started giving Casey specific instructions about their flight path. She needed to slow down just a little and let the Kralix think they were gaining ground. She needed to make it look like the Midnight Runner was running out of options and getting desperate. Casey questioned the order for half a second because every instinct she had said to go faster, not slower. But she trusted Jake and did what he asked. The Kralix ships surged forward, sensing victory. Forthak's tactical officers would be reporting that the human ship was losing speed and making mistakes. Their formation tightened again as they prepared for the final strike that would disable the Midnight Runner's engines. Their weapon systems charged to full power, and targeting computers locked onto the human vessel. In another 10 seconds they would have clear shots and the chase would be over. Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a small remote detonator. It was an old piece of technology that most modern ships did not use anymore, because automated systems were more reliable. But Jake had never trusted automated systems for the things that really mattered. 3 months ago, he had taken on a cargo of mining charges that were supposedly being transported for disposal. The consortium inspectors had examined them and cleared them as inert and safe. What those inspectors had not known was that Jake had very carefully not mentioned that the charges were inert, only until someone reactivated their detonation circuits. He had spent 2 days doing exactly that, and then hiding the charges in specific asteroids along routes he frequently traveled. Insurance policies, he had called them. The Midnight Runner burst through a gap between 2 massive asteroids, and suddenly they were in the middle of the cluster Jake had been aiming for. Methane ice covered the surfaces of dozens of rocks, and the frozen volatiles gleamed in the light from distant stars. The Kralix ships followed without hesitation because they could see their prey right in front of them. Forthak would be ordering his ships to fire on the Midnight Runner's engines to disable rather than destroy. The Kralix wanted prisoners and answers and the satisfaction of a proper trial and punishment. Casey pulled the ship into a tight loop that brought them back through the cluster from a different angle. The maneuver was so unexpected that it caught the Kralix completely off guard. Their ships were suddenly flying in the wrong direction and had to burn hard to reverse course. 2 of the warships nearly collided with each other in the confusion. Their precise military formation dissolved into a chaotic scramble, as each captain tried to reacquire the target and avoid hitting the asteroids at the same time. Jake pressed the button on the detonator. Nothing happened for exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, Jake wondered if the charges had failed or if the circuits had degraded, or if his entire plan was about to collapse. Then the first charge detonated inside a methane-rich asteroid, and the rock exploded in a brilliant flash of orange and white. The force of the explosion fractured the asteroid and sent burning debris flying in all directions. That debris struck other methane asteroids and triggered a cascading chain reaction. Within 5 seconds, a dozen asteroids were exploding. Within 10 seconds, the number had doubled. The methane burned with intense heat and created expanding clouds of superheated gas. The explosions fragmented the rocks and turned them into thousands of high-velocity projectiles. The asteroid field that had been a navigation hazard became a deadly minefield that stretched across several cubic kilometers of space. The Kralix warships found themselves suddenly flying through a storm of fire and debris that their sensors had not predicted, and their tactical computers had not planned for. The first Kralix ship took a direct hit from a chunk of burning rock the size of a cargo container. Its forward shields buckled under the impact, and warning alarms screamed across its bridge. The captain ordered emergency power to the shields, but another impact followed the first and then another. The shields failed and the rock fragments tore through the hull armor. The ship did not explode, but it was crippled and tumbling out of control. Its captain gave the order to abandon pursuit and focus on damage control. The second ship tried to change course, but the explosions had created a maze of debris, fields that shifted and expanded with every passing second. The helmsman pulled hard to starboard to avoid one cluster of fragments and flew straight into another. Multiple impacts hammered the ship's shields and drained power faster than the reactors could compensate. This captain was more experienced and managed to keep his ship intact, but he had to drop out of the pursuit to plot a safe course through the chaos. Casey flew the Midnight Runner through the expanding fireballs with a combination of skill and luck that bordered on supernatural. She was heading for the eye of the storm where Jake had deliberately left a gap in his placement of charges. The ship's shields glowed blue-white from the heat and the proximity alert screamed constantly, but Casey never slowed down. She threaded the needle between explosions and debris clouds with centimeters to spare. Behind them, the remaining Kralik ships were forced to slow down or be destroyed. Their tactical advantage had evaporated, and their overwhelming firepower was useless in the chaos. Vorthak's voice came through the communication system again, but this time there was no calm confidence. He was shouting orders at his ships and demanding status reports. Jake could hear the confusion and anger in the Kralik's commander's voice. Everything had been perfect, and the trap had been flawless, and somehow the human had turned it all into disaster. The Kraliks had never encountered an opponent who responded to being cornered by creating a larger, more dangerous situation. It went against every principle of logical tactical thinking. Frank reported from engineering that the shields were down to 18% and failing. The hull was scorched in multiple places and they had lost 3 of their secondary power conduits. But they were still flying and still in one piece, and that was more than any of the Kralik ships could say at the moment. He asked Jake if the plan was to keep running, or if there was another surprise waiting. Jake told him to bring weapons back online and to prepare for the craziest part of the plan. Frank's response was unprintable, but he started reroute. The Midnight Runner came screaming out of the debris field like a predator that had been hiding in tall grass. Casey had the ship moving at angles that should not have been possible, and using the asteroids as cover in ways that no Kralik's tactical manual had ever considered. The nearest warship was still trying to recover from the shock of the explosions when Jake opened fire. His targeting was precise and surgical. He was not aiming for the hull or the engines or any of the heavily armored sections that would simply absorb his relatively weak weapons. He was aiming for the sensor arrays that stuck out from the ship's exterior, like delicate flowers on a steel tree. The first burst of plasma fire struck the primary sensor dish and melted it into slag. The second burst took out the communication array. The third destroyed the backup sensors. Within 10 seconds, the Kralik's warship was blind and deaf and unable to coordinate with the rest of its fleet. Its captain would be shouting orders and demanding reports, but without sensors, he could not know where the enemy was or where his own ships were positioned. The warship began emergency protocols and started broadcasting on all frequencies, but those broadcasts were unfocused and desperate. Casey was already moving to the next target before the Kraliks could respond. She brought the Midnight Runner through a gap between 2 burning asteroids and lined up on the second warship. This captain had seen what happened to his companion and was trying to bring his ship around to present a smaller target profile. But the maneuver took time, and in that time Jake had a clean shot at the ship's sensor mast. His weapons fired again, and another Kralik's warship lost its ability to see. The captain of that vessel made the mistake of firing blindly in the direction he thought the human ship had gone. His weapons cut through space and struck an asteroid that exploded from the impact. The debris from that explosion damaged his own forward shields. Vorthak's voice came through the communication channel screaming orders at his remaining ships. He was telling them to fall back and regroup and stop firing blindly. But the coordination that had made the Kralik's formation so deadly was falling apart. 2 ships were disabled and drifting. 1 was damaged from debris impacts. That left 3 ships still combat capable, but they were scattered across the asteroid field and could not support each other effectively. Jake had turned their strength into weakness by removing their ability to work together. The Midnight Runner danced through the chaos like it belonged there. Casey was flying on pure instinct now, and her hands moved across the controls without conscious thought. She had entered that mental state where pilot and ship became one thing, and every maneuver flowed naturally from the one before it. Frank was in engineering performing miracles to keep the damaged systems running. He had shut down everything non-essential, and was manually routing power around burnt conduits. The ship was holding together through sheer stubborn refusal to fall apart. Jake targeted the third Kralix ship, but this captain was smarter than the others. He had learned from watching his companions get picked apart, and he was keeping his ship moving unpredictably. His sensor arrays were partially retracted behind armored housings, and he was using the asteroids for cover just like the human ship was doing. Jake fired twice and missed both times. The Kralix captain returned fire, and one blast came close enough to make the Midnight Runner's shields flare bright blue. Casey rolled the ship and dove behind a cluster of rocks before the Kralix could get a target lock. For 30 seconds, the two ships played a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the asteroids. The Kralix warship had more firepower and stronger shields, but the Midnight Runner was smaller and faster. Every time the warship thought it had a clear shot, Casey would duck behind another asteroid or change direction at the last possible second. Every time Jake tried to line up on the sensor arrays, the Kralix captain would shift position. It was a stalemate, and stalemates favored the side with more resources. The Kralix could afford to wait for reinforcements. Jake could not. Then Casey saw an opportunity. There was a gap in the asteroid field ahead that would give them a straight run at the Kralix ship's flank. But reaching that gap required flying through a narrow channel between two massive rocks that were still burning from the earlier explosions. The heat would stress their already damaged shields, and one wrong move would send them crashing into solid stone. Casey did not hesitate. She punched the engines and sent the Midnight Runner into the channel at full speed. The temperature inside the ship spiked as they passed between the burning asteroids. Warning alarms screamed about shield failure and hull stress. Frank's voice came from engineering, shouting something about thermal limits, but his words were lost in the noise. Casey kept her hands steady and her eyes forward. The channel seemed to stretch on forever, but it was really only 3 seconds before they burst out the other side. The shields were down to 9% and flickering, but they had made it. The Kralix captain had not expected the human to take such a dangerous route, and his ship was exposed. Jake did not waste the opportunity. He fired everything the Midnight Runner had at the warship's sensor cluster. Plasma bolts and kinetic rounds hammered into the delicate equipment and tore it apart. The Kralix ship went dark as its primary systems failed. Another warship was out of the fight. That left 2 combat-capable Kralix vessels, and both of them were being much more cautious now. They had watched 3 of their companions get disabled by a ship that should not have posed any threat. Vorthak was still giving orders, but his voice had lost its confident edge. He was telling his remaining captains to maintain distance and use their superior weapons range. He was adapting to the situation, but adapting took time, and time was something the Kralix no longer controlled. Jake made a decision that surprised even Casey. He told her to stop running and to bring the ship to a relative stop behind a large asteroid. Casey questioned the order because stopping meant giving up their greatest advantage, which was speed and maneuverability. Jake insisted, and Casey trusted him enough to do what he asked. The Midnight Runner settled into a stable position, and for the first time since the battle started, they were not moving. Frank asked what the plan was because sitting still seemed like a good way to get killed. Jake explained that the Kralix were being cautious now, which meant they would approach slowly and carefully. He needed them to come close enough to spring one more surprise. He asked Frank if there was any way to make their shields look like they were failing completely. Frank thought about it for a moment and then said he could create that illusion by venting plasma and routing power through damaged conduits. It would look like the ship was dying. Jake told him to do it. The Midnight Runner began to list slightly to one side, and plasma vented from several points on the hull. The shields flickered and dimmed. To anyone watching on sensors, it would look like a ship that had taken too much damage and was on the verge of total systems failure. Jake opened a communication channel to Vorthak, and his voice sounded tired and defeated. He said his ship was dead in space and his crew was injured. He offered to surrender if Vorthak would guarantee medical treatment for Casey and Frank. It was a convincing performance. Vorthak's response was cautious, but Jake could hear the hope in the Kralix commander's voice. He agreed to the terms and ordered his 2 remaining ships to approach the Midnight Runner carefully. They were to maintain weapons lock and fire if the human ship showed any sign of hostile action. The 2 warships began moving toward Jake's position with their shields at maximum and their guns ready. They were being careful, but they were also convinced that the battle was over. Jake watched them approach on the tactical display. He was counting distances and waiting for exactly the right moment. Casey had her hands on the controls ready to move. Frank had quietly rerouted power back to the engines and shields without making it obvious on external sensors. The Kralix ships came closer and closer. They were within optimal weapons range now. They were close enough that their targeting computers would have difficulty missing. Jake waited 5 more seconds. The Kralix captains would be preparing boarding parties and planning how to secure the human prisoners. Vorthak would be savoring his victory and already composing the report he would send to his superiors. Everything seemed to be going according to plan for the Kralix. That was exactly what Jake wanted them to think. He gave Casey the signal. She slammed the engines to full power, and the Midnight Runner surged forward directly at the nearest Kralix warship. The sudden acceleration caught the Kralix completely by surprise. Their weapons fired, but Casey was already rolling, and the shots passed through empty space. Jake fired at point-blank range, not at the sensors this time, but at something more critical. His weapon struck the Kralix ship's communication dish and its navigation beacon. The ship was not disabled, but it was isolated. It could not coordinate with its companion or call for help. The second Kralix ship tried to track the Midnight Runner, but Casey was flying evasive patterns that used the first ship as a shield. The Kralix captains could not fire on the human vessel without risking hitting each other. Their tactical advantage had become a liability again. Jake targeted the second ship's sensors and destroyed them with a sustained burst of fire. Now both remaining warships were funk. The Midnight Runner limped away from the Nereid belt 3 hours after the battle ended. The ship looked like it had been through a war, and in many ways it had. Scorch marks covered the hull where Kralix weapons had come too close. 2 of the external sensor pods were completely destroyed. The portside thruster was making a grinding noise that Frank said was probably not dangerous, but definitely not good. Casey had to compensate for a slight drift in the navigation system. That made flying in a straight line harder than it should have been. But the engines were running and the life support was stable. And most importantly, the medical supplies in the cargo hold were intact. Jake sat in the captain's chair and watched the stars slide past the viewport. His body ached from being thrown around during the battle, and he had a bruise on his shoulder from where he had hit a bulkhead during one of Casey's more extreme maneuvers. But he was alive and his crew was alive, and they had a job to finish. He pulled up the navigation chart and plotted the course to Frontier Station 7. With the Kralix fleet scattered and disabled, there was nothing between them and their destination. The blockade that had seemed impossible to break was now wide open. Frank emerged from engineering looking like he had aged 10 years in the past few hours. His uniform was covered in grease and carbon scoring. He had burns on his hands from manually replacing a power coupling while it was still hot. He dropped into one of the spare seats and accepted the water bottle that Casey handed him without a word. For a long moment, nobody spoke. They were all processing what had just happened and trying to reconcile the fact that they had survived something that should have killed them. Casey broke the silence by asking the question that was on everyone's mind. She wanted to know if Jake had actually planned all of that, or if he had just been making it up as he went along. Jake thought about his answer carefully. He admitted that he had known about the methane asteroids and he had planted the mining charges months ago as a precaution. He had recognized the Kralix formation as following standard military doctrine which made their positions predictable. But the specific sequence of events and the moment-by-moment decisions had been improvised based on what the situation demanded. It had been equal parts planning and desperation. Frank pointed out that desperation seemed to be Jake's primary tactical philosophy. He said it with enough humor that Jake knew the old engineer was not seriously complaining. They had all signed up for this life knowing it would involve risks that most people considered insane. The difference was that Jake had a talent for turning those risks into opportunities. Frank admitted grudgingly that the plan had worked, even if it had taken years off his life from stress. He said the shield modifications he had made were probably the only reason they were still alive, and Jake agreed completely. The journey to Frontier Station 7 took 3 days. The Midnight Runner could have made it faster, but Frank insisted on making repairs along the way rather than arriving at their destination with systems on the verge of failure. Casey used the time to recalibrate the navigation systems and clean the carbon scoring out of the maneuvering thrusters. Jake caught up on sleep that he had been missing for the past week. They passed 2 other ships during the journey and both vessels gave them a wide berth. Word was already spreading about what had happened in the Nereid belt. Frontier Station 7 appeared on their sensors as a collection of habitat modules clustered around an old mining platform. It was not impressive to look at, and it certainly was not wealthy. The station survived on a combination of small-scale mining operations and agricultural exports. But the people who lived there were tough and resourceful, and they took care of each other. When the plague had broken out, they had done everything they could with the resources available. It just had not been enough without proper medical supplies. The station's traffic control gave the Midnight Runner immediate clearance to dock. Jake could hear the relief in the controller's voice. They had been waiting for this shipment and hoping it would arrive before more people died. Casey brought the ship into the docking bay with her usual skill, and the clamps engaged with a solid thunk that meant they were secure. Frank started the shutdown procedures while Jake went to the cargo hold to prepare the medical supplies for transfer. A medical team was waiting at the airlock before Jake even had it fully open. They were led by a doctor named Lisa Hayes, who looked like she had not slept in days. Her eyes were red from exhaustion, but her hands were steady as she checked the cargo manifest. Jake helped her team load the supplies onto their transport carts. Antibiotics and antivirals and immune boosters and a dozen other medications that would save lives. Lisa thanked Jake with tears in her eyes, and he felt uncomfortable with the gratitude. He had just been doing his job, even if that job had nearly gotten him killed. The station administrator met with Jake in a small office near the docks. He was a thin man named Peter Cross who wore the weight of responsibility for 3,000 lives on his shoulders. He transferred the payment for the job into Jake's account, and then he asked how much extra it would cost to convince Jake to stay for a few days. The Midnight Runner needed repairs that the station's technicians could provide, and Peter wanted to throw a celebration dinner for the crew that had broken the blockade. Jake accepted both offers because the ship genuinely needed the work, and because turning down hospitality from grateful people seemed wrong. The dinner that night was held in the station's largest common area. It was not fancy, but the food was real and fresh rather than recycled protein paste. The colonists had prepared dishes from a dozen different Earth cultures, and the tables were full of people who wanted to meet the crew of the Midnight Runner. Children ran between the tables laughing and playing and very much alive because of the medicine that had arrived. Jake watched them and felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized was tight. Casey spent most of the evening talking to a group of young pilots who wanted to hear stories about flying through the asteroid field. She downplayed the danger and focused on the technical aspects of the maneuvers, but Jake could see the admiration in the young pilot's eyes. Frank was cornered by the station's engineering team who bombarded him with questions about ship systems and modifications. He pretended to be annoyed, but Jake noticed he was enjoying the attention. News of the battle had spread faster than Jake had expected. A merchant captain who had been monitoring long-range sensors from outside the Nereid belt had recorded part of the fight. He had transmitted the data to several trading posts, and from there it had spread across the communication networks. The story was already growing in the telling. Some versions had Jake destroying all 6 Kralix warships. Others claimed he had been outnumbered 20-1. The truth was impressive enough, but people seemed to prefer the legend. Jake received messages over the next few days from sources he had not heard from in years. Other smugglers wanted to know his tricks. Legitimate shipping companies offered him contracts with pay rates that would have set him up for life. A few colonial governments asked if he would be willing to run their blockades. He ignored most of the messages, but he kept a few that seemed genuine. The galaxy was full of people who needed help and could not get it through official channels. That was the market Jake operated in. The most interesting message came from a Kralix merchant who operated independently of the enforcement fleet. He said that Vorthak had been recalled to the Kralix homeworld to explain his failure. The loss of 6 warships without capturing a single human smuggler was being treated as a major embarrassment. Other Kralix commanders were studying the battle data and trying to understand what had gone wrong. The conclusion they were reaching was disturbing to their military doctrine. Humans did not follow predictable patterns when cornered. They created chaos and used that chaos as a weapon. It was a style of fighting that the Kralix had no good counter for. The repairs to the Midnight Runner took 4 days, and the station's technicians did excellent work. Frank supervised every step and made sure the new components met his exacting standards. The hull was patched and reinforced. The sensor pods were replaced with upgraded models. The thruster that had been making grinding noises was completely rebuilt. When the work was done, the ship was in better condition than it had been before the battle. Peter Cross refused to charge them full price for the repairs, saying it was the least the station could do. On the morning they were scheduled to depart, Casey asked Jake where they were heading next. He pulled up a star chart and showed her a system on the far edge of explored space. There was a refugee camp there that needed evacuation before a civil war reached their location. The job paid almost nothing and the risks were substantial. No legitimate transport company would touch it. Casey looked at the chart and then at Jake, and then she smiled. She said it sounded like exactly the kind of job they specialized in. Frank joined them on the bridge carrying a toolkit and a cup of something that smelled like coffee, but probably was not. He took one look at the star chart and shook his head. He said they were all crazy, and someone should probably stop them before they got themselves killed. Then he sat down at the engineering station and began running pre-flight checks. His actions spoke.